and welcome everyone to our second preservation school class of the summer. We have two more coming up. We have one tomorrow on how to engage and nurture community groups. That's with Sam Addo from Urban Archive. Same time, 5 to 6 o'clock. And then next Tuesday, we have the economic benefits of historic preservation with Andrew Goldwyn from the New York Landmarks Conservancy. So those should both be great classes. If you've not signed up, please do so. You can do the same way on our website. The class from last week will be up on our YouTube channel soon, along with all of our other preservation school classes. So if you've missed any in the past, please go check those out. They're all great resources. And tonight we have an amazing class with Sarah Bean Apmann, teaching us how to create an RFE for the Landmarks Preservation Commission. And with that, I will hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you. Okay, let me get my screen up. Okay. I was just saying to Michelle that I have done this. Whoops, let me go back. Escape. I've written a number of RFEs before, but this is the first time I'm giving a class in this. So we'll see what everybody thinks. Hopefully you all will like it. Let me get it over. I use a second screen, so that helps me a little bit. So hello, thank you for joining me tonight. Tonight we're going to look at writing an RFE, or I felt like I had to spell it out, request for eligibility in order to pursue New York City landmark designation. We will start out, and for those of you that I saw a few people that I recognized in there who I know are going to know some of this beginning information, so I hope you'll bear with me. And you know, I had to do it for a broad audience in case there were some people that were unfamiliar with some aspects of landmark designation. So we're going to start out defining what a landmark is, the different types of landmarks. We're going to look at various resources and forms provided by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. And following that, we will look into some sources to aid in researching your potential landmark in helping you to make a case for significance, which is what this is really all about. And finally, we'll look at some examples of RFEs that I've had a hand in, both in terms of research and reading. So next, here we go. So first of all, what is a landmark? As defined by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, it is a building, property, or object that has a special character or special historic or aesthetic interest or value as part of the development, heritage, or culture characteristics of the city, state, or nation. A building must be more than 30 years old and have historical and architectural significance as determined by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. I just recently resigned from village preservation. I'm back to freelance, but prior to that, I also was working as a consultant, and my background was largely with listing on the state and national register. So although I went to school in New York City, I was kind of surprised when I started doing RFEs in New York City that there weren't defined criterion the way you see in state and national register listing. Also, with state and national register listing, a building has to be 50 years old or older. So I find the definition from New York City is a bit more, vague is the wrong word, but a bit more broad than the concise criterion I was used to back when I was doing strictly state and national. So there are 4 different types of landmarks, the first of which is individual landmarks, such as the Brown Building, which is famous for the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. It was designated a New York City landmark in 2003, and it is located at 2329 Washington Place, built between 1900 and 1911 and designed by architect John Woolley in the Neo-Renaissance style. And as seen in the designation report for the building, its significance, again, the idea of writing an RFE is making a case for the significance, lies in its place in labor, New York City, and US history as the site of the tragic event of the fire in which 146 workers died due to locked doors and inadequate fire escapes. According to the designation report, and this speaks to its significance and therefore the reason for its designation, the tragedy stunned the nation and became a catalyst for a broad range of reforms. In the next few years following the fire, New York City and New York State adopted a battery of new laws to protect the public from fires and ensure the health and safety of workers. The new laws were the most advanced comprehensive country at the time and served as models for other states, local ordinances, and for the federal legislation of the New Deal era 20 years later. The next type of landmark designation that we're going to look at is an historic district, which is defined as an area where a group of buildings and sites have a distinct sense of place or character and feature cohesive streetscapes. The buildings and sites that make up a historic district represent a specific period or style of architecture that represents the city's history. And here is the South Village Historic District, which was designated in 2013. And according to the designation report, it, quote, consists of approximately 250 buildings, including row houses, tenements, commercial structures, and institutions with streetscapes that illustrate the growth of the neighborhood from its origins as an affluent residential area in the early 19th century to a vibrant community of artists and working class immigrants in the early 20th century. Throughout the 20th century, the blocks of the South Village Historic District have served as one of the most important and famous centers of artistic, social, and cultural movements and foment in the city. The area was the center of 20th century gay and lesbian life in New York, while its music clubs nourished generations of artists from jazz to folk to rock. Bohemians and beatniks congregated in its famous cafes, and a flourishing off-Broadway scene developed in its small theaters. And I think that one of the things that this significant statement, to note from the significant statement, is how long the period of significance is. Period of significance is the time in which what's important occurred, of course. And this spans from, sort of early mid 19th century well into the 20th century. And it is important for that in terms of the regulation of these landmarks as people start to file for permits within this district. In other words, if there's a building that speaks that its physicality speaks to one of the things that was outlined here, the music clubs, the small theaters, that's important in terms of the regulation, in terms of the LPC considering changes within those buildings. The next type is interior landmarks. In addition to meeting the definition of a landmark that I stated earlier, it should also be, quote, customarily open or accessible to the public, or to which the public is customarily invited. So the example I always show is the old Merchant's House, also known as the Seabury Treadwell House, located at 29 East 4th Street. It was designated a New York City individual landmark in 1965, among the first designations shortly after the passage of the New York City Landmarks Law in the same year. And it was designated a New York City interior landmark in 1981, rather. It is also part of the NoHo Historic District Extension. It is a National Historic Landmark, and it is listed on the New York State and National Registers of Historic Places. One common type in New York City of interior landmarks are New York City subway stations, such as the Astor Place station. Here are the Habs drawings, which were done in 1936 of the Seabury Treadwell House, the same year that it opened as a museum, showing the interior plan in section, in plan and in section, and some of the interior details. For those of you that don't know, HAB stands for Historic American Building Survey. It is a documentation program by the federal government. It was started during the Depression, documenting some of the country's historic sites and structures. It was originally done to employ out-of-work architects and engineers during the Depression. These drawings are available online through the Library of Congress. They are lots of fun to look through. They also have photo documentation from the same time that they were doing these drawings, and they're really actually quite beautiful. So I recommend looking through them for no other reason than just for fun. These drawings detail how intact the Merchant's House was to its construction at that time, and it continues to be so today. The form that it shows you is typical of New York City row houses at this time and into the 19th century. You have the raised basement level, which would have the kitchen at the rear, which would spill out into the backyard, which was largely utilitarian in its nature at that time. The dining or family room was at the front again, the basement level. The next level, the parlor floor level, has front and rear parlor, and that would be accessed through the front stoop. The next two levels have formal bedrooms, and the attic space was largely for servants and had very low ceilings. I guess the servants didn't have to stand up very tall. So then we move on. This is the next type of landmark, a scenic landmark. Which includes city-owned parks or other landscape features such as Bryant Park. In total, there are more than 37,000 landmark properties in New York City, most of which are located in its 149 historic districts and historic district extensions in all 5 boroughs. The total number of protected sites also includes 1,439 individual landmarks, 120 interior landmarks, and 11 scenic landmarks. So the first thing we're going to do when looking at places that will give you information to help you write an RFE is the most obvious, which is the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission website, which has a number of resources. First of all, it shows you all of the landmarks in the area. So one of the first things you'll want to do when pursuing a landmark designation, and I know this sounds obvious, but it's to make sure the property isn't already landmarked. This map, as I said, which is available through the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission webpage, you can search it by address. There we go. Right here, you can type in the address, or you can zoom in on a particular location. The yellow areas indicate historic district, pink dots indicate individual landmarks, blue indicate interior landmarks, and the green areas indicate scenic landmarks. In addition to showing what is landmarked, this map also shows you on each of the buildings or sites dates of construction, architect, original owner, style, major alterations and use. It also provides a link to the designation report or reports. You could have an individual landmark within a district, so then you'd have 2 designation reports to look at. Here, I clicked on 232 East 11th Street, which is where Historic Districts Council is located. It's the rectory for St. Mark's, if you don't know. And we see here that it was built in 1899, designed by Ernest Flagg. It also provides some other information as that I mentioned before. And here it has the link to the designation report of the St. Mark's Historic District. So in writing our RFEs, LPC provides 2 forms of an RFE form, if you will. The first is for individual landmarks, interior landmarks, and scenic landmarks. And you can see that the information on the first page is pretty basic. Who's requesting and basic information about the property. Just as an FYI for New York City landmarks, you don't need owner's consent, but it does help if they do pursue landmark designation in terms of positive press. The second page broadly asks for the building or site's significance. You can see right here it leaves this blank. You'll want to make a case for significance that aligns with the definition for a landmark that I gave you earlier. That is, the site or the building has a special character or special historic or aesthetic value. As part of the development of the city, state, or nation. Most likely your description of the significance will go well beyond this page right here. I've always actually submitted RFEs bypassing the form and just submitted as a letter to the LPC. I also recommend, as part of your narrative, a bibliography or a source list. And there are some other considerations as well that I'll go into as we get further into this presentation. You will also need to submit current photos. hopefully illustrating the building or site as intact to the time of significance. So the time that you're calling out for significance, hopefully features are still remaining intact on that site or structure. And here's sort of an example. So here's 59 Morton Street. And if I'm trying to make the case for the fact that this building is significant as this is obviously like a late federal row house, the fact that it retains most of its features from that time is definitely going to work in my favor. Conversely, say I want to illustrate the fact that, or I'm going for the significance of perhaps 16 West 9th Street as the fact that it was home to the artist James Wall Finn. He was pretty well known at his time, and he did one of the ceilings at the New York Public Library. So this was originally an Italianate house from the mid 19th century. You can see what it used to look like, or part of it used to look like as it was originally built. It was modified at the time that James Wall Finn owned it. So the fact that its appearance speaks to this artist's residence definitely bolsters the case for significance. You know, if I wanted to say that, oh well, yeah, this over here, Morton Street, not only is it significant as a representation of the late federal style, but it also was lived in by a resident, you know, when Greenwich Village was brimming with artists rather, at the beginning of the 20th century. Certainly, you know, the fact that it's intact to its 19th century appearance is fine. However, it would be difficult to make the case that 16 West 9th Street is significant as an example of 19th century architecture, since it is largely changed since in the 20th century. The other form that they provide is for making an RFE for a historic district. Here, again, you're going to want to make the case for significance and the approximate area that you're going to be proposing for designation. This also requires current photographs of representative streetscapes. Cohesive streetscapes are part of the argument for a historic district. And you're also going to want to make a map of proposed boundaries. Either form or a letter, like I said, that I've done, goes to rfe@lpc.nyc.gov. And if people would like, and I'm happy to do so, I do this frequently, I'm happy to make a list that can be distributed of important websites that come up through this discussion. So when submitting for, it's important to suggest boundaries that make sense, both for the case for significance and in terms of including the cohesive streetscapes that I mentioned. Of course, within a historic district, there will be non-contributing buildings, that is, buildings that don't speak to the case for significance, but you certainly want the majority of them to be contributing. That said, and assuming that LPC pursues the suggested district for designation, they will in all likelihood modify your proposed boundaries. And here what we see is the Gansevoort Market State and National Register District outlined in heavy black right here. And this is also what Village Preservation originally proposed as the city historic district. The city, however, did not agree with these boundaries that the state did, and what the sort of purple color speaks to what is the New York City Historic District. And again, for those of you that don't know, New York City does not regulate or oversee buildings that are only listed on the state and national register. They do have to be identified as New York City landmarks. There are communities, I've worked with them, I've worked for them, that will protect state and national register listed properties within their communities. New York City is not one of them. So within the type of historic districts, there's also something known as extensions. And this isn't a separate type of landmark, but it is a separate, a different type of historic district. So in the case of an extension, an adjoining section of a neighborhood, which is adjacent to an existing historic district, has been deemed designation worthy of designation and part of the story of the original district. And what I'm showing here is this is the NoHo Historic District, which was designated in 1999. And over here, an extension was added to that district designated in 2008. And what was decided was the story that made this area significant and its intact architectural features also existed over here on the east side. And so an extension was made in 2008. Down here, just for your information, is the NoHo East Historic District. So while it does adjoin, it's felt to have a slightly different story than its two neighbors to the north. So an important thing, by the way, if anybody can hear my dog, I apologize. My son has him downstairs. I was hoping she would stay quiet, but I don't know that she's going to cooperate. She's not a preservationist. So an important thing to try and do when suggesting a landmark is to align with the Landmark Preservation Commission priorities. In January of 2021, LPC announced the launch of its equity framework, which is an approach that is being applied to different aspects of the LPC. According to the press release, this includes, quote, prioritizing designations that represent New York City's diversity and designations in areas less represented by landmarks. And they cited recent designations in their examples. So they showed here representing African-American history, recent designations, including the Mount Morris Park Historic District Extension in Harlem, West 132nd Historic District, and the James Baldwin House, which is identified as the most significant surviving building in the United States associated with the celebrated novelist, essayist, poet, and civil rights advocate. They also talked about the reflecting New York City's diversity, citing the Stonewall Inn, the home of African-American novelist Audre Lorde, and Coney Island's Boardwalk, which deviated from the other diversity that they were talking about in terms of socioeconomic diversity. In terms of Coney Island's Boardwalk has given people of all economic and social backgrounds free access to the beach and seaside since 1923, and it's the embodiment of Coney Island's democratic spirit. They also talked about geographic diversity in terms of throughout New York City. I think what they're really talking about is not letting Staten Island and the Bronx get forgotten about. I grew up on Staten Island, I can make the joke. And then also looking at difficult and contested histories, which are not always pleasant to talk about, but very important that we recognize them. So they cite Menaigne Street in the South Bronx, and the Public School 48 in South Jamaica, Queens. Their designation reports include the history of redlining and disinvestment in the neighborhoods as part of the narrative. Also designation of the row of 5 buildings that represent Tin Pan Alley, recognizing the significant contributions and achievements of African Americans in music publishing, and also acknowledging the Jim Crow laws and other unjust discriminatory practices entrenched in systemic racism that led to the racist characters and stereotypes of African Americans in the sheet music produced in Tin Pan Alley. So now we get to researching the building so we can make these great cases for significance. The Landmarks Preservation Commission and HDC have created research guides to help you learn more about your historic buildings, both of which are available online. And these guides are intended to assist you in finding construction dates, architects, original owners, alterations to building, changes in ownership over time, the names of building residents, historic photos, among other information. So we'll look at some of the things that they highlight in their in these guides. One of the first things that you want to do is what I always say is don't reinvent the wheel. And you want to start by seeing if the building site or area has already been identified in New York State's Cultural Resource Information System, also known as CRIS. The building or site could have been documented for any number of reasons, including local structures or cultural resource surveys, environmental reviews. They could also be listed on state and national register of historic places within a district or deemed eligible for listing. So when you get to this page, you click on search and it takes you to this page. So you can zoom in on your particular site. Here I zoomed in once again on 232 East 11th Street, which is part of the State and National Register listed historic district, St. Mark's Historic District. The tabs above over here provide other information. Again, you might get an architect out of it, a build date. If you have trouble finding the State and National Register designation report, it used to be that they were all here under attachments, but sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not. I would definitely contact the New York State Historic Preservation Office. They're very friendly there and very helpful. Another great resource is the New York City Department of Buildings online building information system. Again, I did a search for 232 East 11th Street. And all the information comes up here. And really it's everything that they have on the buildings. Obviously right here, it's identified as a landmark. It also has permits issued over here, processor issued, job filings, violations. They also have actions, which is down here. Actions is interesting because it will identify past permits, but you can't see what the permits are. But sometimes those permit numbers can help you out in terms of finding out more information on the building. They do, however, under actions frequently have links to actual C of Os. C of Os were not issued by New York City until 1938, however. But again, people always, before and to this day, will file permits which aren't necessarily acted upon. I'll frequently see new building permits that I find out are not actually executed. One of the best things about the C of Os is that confirms whether an alteration permit or demolition permit or new building permit was executed. And then the other source that I wanted to look at quickly was the New York City Map. This is good in terms of finding out block and lot. It's an easy way to find out block and lot, which you need for some of the resources that I'm going to go through. Here, I looked at St. Mark's Episcopal Church, and I did that for a reason. The one thing that this map frequently has wrong is the date of construction. I find that any building that was built before World War I, frequently it gives just a generic date, not the actual date of the building. I would really prefer if they wrote just unknown if they don't know. You can see right here, it says that St. Mark's was built in 1900, and we know that it was built in 1799. But there is, you can see the beginning of it here over on the right-hand side. There is, you can check off some of the filters along here, and you can get a bunch of things figured out, capital projects, school districts, community board districts, landmark designation, that kind of thing. So one of the things that you would try and look for most likely when you were trying to research a building is any kind of permits you can find. New building permit applications have been required for every building constructed in Manhattan since 1866. They have been required for new buildings in the West Bronx since 1874, when New York City annexed the area west of the Bronx River, and for Brooklyn buildings constructed since 1878. NB applications became required for all other areas of what is now New York City, including Queens and Staten Island, by 1898. New building applications include the date of filing and often building completion, the architect's name, address, original owner's name, address, original building and lot dimensions, and construction details, which can be really helpful. The new building application for a building often resides within its block and lot folder, which may also contain later alteration applications and architectural drawings documenting the building over history. For buildings in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and Manhattan for blocks above 968, the block and lot folders may be requested at the Manhattan office of the building department. And I will say, back when I was in grad school, I was trying to research these late 19th century row houses that were really cool. They stepped down the hill, and the molding around the transom lights sort of stepped down with it along all 5 row houses. But I had no way of being able to draw these buildings because I didn't know the dimensions. And I went to the Department of Buildings and I grabbed the block and lot folder, and inside was this plumber's sketch, which had a section of the front facade of one of the buildings that was done to scale. So I actually had the exact dimensions of the building. You never know what you're going to find in the block and lot folder. And sometimes, unfortunately, you don't find anything. So the next resource that I recommend looking at is the New York City Municipal Archives. They have the block and lot folders for Manhattan below 968. They also have docket books for new building and alteration permits between 1866 and 1959. And this is very helpful, especially when stuff is missing from the block and lot folder. They have the tax assessment records. These records often indicate the presence of a building on the lot and the building in stories. The Municipal Archives holds tax assessment records for Manhattan from 1789 to 1979, Brooklyn 1866 to 1975, Queens 1899 to 1988, the Bronx from 1897 to 1962, and Staten Island 1899 to 1979. Note that and this is great for buildings, again, before the permits were required. So, I gave you those dates for when permits started to be required for each of the boroughs. So looking at the tax records can help in terms of dating a building before the new building permits existed. Note that the block and lot numbers often have changed over time, and historic tax assessments were often organized by ward. So it's crucial to consult historic maps to determine the correct ward number and historic block and lot numbers in order to determine this period of construction. And I'll get into where you can access maps that would tell you that information in just a moment. Also, the Municipal Archives has circa 1939 and 1988 tax photos, which are available online. Here again, the block and lots may have changed, so you want to look at historic maps. They also have a general collection of historic images. Both the tax photos and the historic images are available at this website here. The other thing I wanted to mention was the City Register for deed research. This has all conveyance or deed records, which can trace the ownership of buildings over time. Conveyances and mortgage records from 1966 to the present, except for Staten Island, are available online through the automated city register, also known as ACRIS. If you're looking for Manhattan, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, up to 1865, you can go to each of the city's register offices. More information is available through the website I just listed. Staten Island property records are at the Office of Richmond County Clerk at 130 Stuyvesant Place. And here are some other resources which are great. The New York Public Library has wonderful online databases that otherwise would cost you money. You could always go to the branches to access these, including Ancestry.com, which has all the federal census records and some of the New York State census records, as well as ProQuest. During COVID, because people couldn't go into the branches with your New York Public Library card, you could still access these online databases. They also have historic maps and atlases. That's where you would go to find out possibly historic block and lot numbers or change in addresses. Changing in not just street names, but street numbering sometimes happens. So it's good to understand if the street address changed for your property over time, because that's going to affect your searches. New York Public Library also has online the New York City directories between 1786 and 1923, and these are absolutely invaluable. They also have a few spotty ones after 1923 and a couple in different boroughs. In the Milstein room, you can go to see New York City phone books, which are on microfilm. We actually determined where Stanley Kubrick lived in the East Village by using that resource, although I hate microfilm, it was exciting to find that. And then New York Public Library also has a wonderful online historic photo search. It's map-based, so it's very easy to use. Here are some other resources: Museum of the City of New York and New York Historical Society, which have wonderful photos. And then Urban Archive, which is sort of one-stop shopping, which public libraries, access to their database, Museum of the City of New York, and other online resources as well. And then the other resource always to look at are different historic newspapers, and here are just a couple that have been super helpful. New York State Historic Newspapers is really fun. They have stuff going all the way back into the 1800s, the early 1800s. They also have some more modern ones. When I was with Village Preservation, the Villager went onto this database, I don't know, about 3 or 4 years ago, between 1959 and the 1990s. And that's been a huge help in terms of looking at local history, in more recent local history in that area. So the other thing to use as sort of background information is the designation reports. And through the map that I showed you before on the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission website, you can access these designation reports. And sometimes you can get, if you are researching a building and perhaps there's a district nearby, you can find out the background of the area. You can also, the designation reports, the later ones, not the very early ones, but the later ones have sources outlined, which you can also use in your own research. And you can also, especially with more recent designation reports, understand the language and how they're making cases for significance in terms of crafting your own. So it also has the filter, which you see right here, which allows you to pull out the landmarks according to certain criteria. The one that's been the most helpful for me is doing it by architect. Whenever I write an RFE, I like to have information about the architect. And so here, I did a filter by the architect Ernest Flagg, and I found four buildings that were built by Ernest Flagg. One is over here at 232 East 11th Street. We have 561, 563 Broadway, aka 88 Prince Street in the Soho district. And then we also have these two buildings. This is Mills House number 1 at 156 Bleecker Street in the South Village Historic District, and 183 Sullivan Street, also in the South Village Historic District. And so I'm able to click on the South Village Historic District also and get access to the designation report. And in the later designation reports at the end are descriptions of the architects. Again, don't ever reinvent the wheel. And so here's a complete description of Ernest Flagg and his significance as an architect. At the end is also resources. And again, this can help in terms of your research, creating your case for significance in your RFE. So now I'm going to go into some RFEs that I've submitted or I've had a hand in. The first one I'm going to look at is San Isidoro y San Leandro Western Orthodox Catholic Church. You know what I just realized? Why is this? Hold on. Oh, well, I'm not going to worry about it. Located at 345 East 4th Street in Manhattan. we submitted a designation for calling it as an individual landmark. This remarkably intact Gothic Revival church was built in 1891 and 92 by Edward Wentz, and its form, design, details, and history reflect the kaleidoscope of immigrants and ethnic groups which called the Lower East Side home and who shaped New York over the last century and a quarter. Originally, this structure was built for the Church of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, catering to the surrounding Slavic and Hungarian immigrant community of the late 19th century and early 20th century.
I can't be bothered. Truly, I can't.
The church was the first national Slavic parish for the Slavic and Hungarian Catholics of New York and Brooklyn. Later, the building was bought by the Russian Greek Orthodox National Association and became the Carpathian Russian Orthodox Church of St. Nicholas. It served the emerging Russian immigrant community in the early and mid 20th century, as evidenced by the royal seal of the Russian czars located in the church's front gate right there. After 1975, the church housed San Isidoro y San Leandro, Western Orthodox Catholic Church of the Hispanic Mozarabic Rite, a highly unusual Western Orthodox Catholic church, seemingly one of the very few in America and one of the very few, perhaps only, to practice the Mozarabic Rite. We also submitted to the New York State Historic Preservation, the State Historic Preservation Office, a request for a determination of eligibility for listing on the state and national register of historic places, and that was approved. Here are some of the sources that I use for it. The Real Estate Record and Builders Guide, which I get online, and anybody can through Columbia University's online library resources. Here we have another building that the architect is identifications of alteration permits and the new building permit. Here's the new building permit, which we found with the municipal archives. Here we have the historic photos we also submitted, as well as various news articles we found on the church. And also we found the deed, the 1975 deed through Acris, that details the sale of the church in 1975 by the Russian Orthodox Church to Reverend Patricio Cubillos Murillo. And it was then that it became home to the San Isidoro y San Leandro Western Orthodox Catholic Church. And we thought we made a pretty good case for this building designation, and I think we did. However, LPC did deny our request, and these were the examples that, this was the reasons that it cited, saying that it's very careful when it does choose religious structures, and it feels that religious architecture is already very well represented in the historic district in the East Village. It also talks about the fact that there were many religious structures in the East Village that served the immigrant communities. It also disputed the fact that the paint was changed, which is, I think, really stupid, because paint can be changed back. And then finally, it also questioned whether the Mozarabic rite was ever practiced actually at this location. And I got to tell you, looking at the interior pictures, something was being practiced there. So now we'll move on to another. This is the White Horse Tavern, located at 567 Hudson Street. It is part of the Greenwich Village Historic District, and we proposed the White Horse Tavern specifically as an interior landmark. This is a 19th century wood frame house. And according to its owners, the White Horse Tavern dates back to 1880. It began as one of the many bars in the West Village to serve the West Village's Irish community and Irish American community, largely serving the longshoremen and other workers from the docks along the Hudson River. In the early 20th century, it transformed. During the 1930s and 40s. The White Horse became an important meeting place for labor organizations and communist groups, and it was the center of many political power struggles of the era. Directly following this, the White Horse was closely associated with the literati of the mid-20th century, when Greenwich Village drew poets and writers from across the country and world, and the White Horse Tavern was central to that scene. Taverns such as the White Horse were in the 1950s more than just places for these creative souls to imbibe, and some did that quite to excess. They were also modern day versions of 19th century literary salons where artists, writers, and intellectuals gathered to talk, argue, pontificate, and share and cross-pollinate ideas. So here we stress the history associated with the Irish immigrant history of the area, labor history, and literary and cultural history. We also stress through photo documentation the intactness of here see Dylan Thomas, date unknown, Delmore Schwartz in 1959, and Jane Jacobs in 1961, who lived just down the street on the same block. And she referenced the White Horse Tavern in her seminal work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And here we show a picture of activists who were advocating for the designation of the White Horse Tavern. The New York Post photographer told us not to smile in the picture. Unfortunately, the Landmarks Preservation Commission did not designate the interior of this building. It is very difficult to get an interior landmark, but it was definitely, if you're going to go for one, I thought the White Horse Tavern was definitely the one to give it a shot. 13th Street. It was originally built as a Greek Revival row house between 1846 and 1847. I got that through the tax records, the property tax records that I referenced earlier in the municipal archives. In 1958, number 50 West 13th Street was altered from a store manufactory to a theater in the basement and first floor, while the second and third floors were housed apartments. And our first letter trying to make a case for significance in this building surrounded the significance of the site as part of the off Broadway movement and its history in New York. The theater company, which first called 50 West 13th Street home, was Washington Players Studio, which was formed at the beginning of the Villager as the off Broadway movement. In 1972, the 13th Street Repertory Company was founded by Edith O'Hara, and it remained there under O'Hara's operation until her passing, which was somewhat recent. Unfortunately, O'Hara was known for championing up-and-coming artists and allowed actors and writers to explore and create in an uninhibited atmosphere. And then we further delved into this. A number of people called us saying that this was definitely part of the Underground Railroad. And so we started to look into this a little further. And what was interesting was we had seen previously that Jacob Day, a gentleman named Jacob Day, had had his catering business here. But some of the directories we looked through didn't identify him as an African-American. So we just thought of it as one of the businesses that had lived here in terms of its significance. And this shows right here the information that we got from the 1859 to 1860 directory. And you can see right here that while the other people who lived at 50 West 13th Street, he frequently rented out part of the house to other people, were identified as African Americans. He was not in that directory. However, when we got to later directories, we started to look into this a little further, and we found out that, in fact, he was quite significant. Jacob Day was one of the New York's most successful and prominent businessmen during the 19th century. He was also a prominent abolitionist and member and treasurer of the then nearby Abyssinian Baptist Church. Here are a number of articles that we found on Day. He was cited twice in the National Anti-Slavery Standard, advocating for African-American rights, and his wealth, success, and influence were well cited by a number of other writers from the time. This is a recent article. The story of this building caught the interest of the New York Times, and we submitted to them a lot of the primary research that we were able to uncover about the building, and they wrote a full-page article which was published in March of 2021. And its designation is still remains to be seen on whether this will go through. So one of the things I want to stress in terms of, when you're submitting an RFE and trying to make the push for your RFE is don't just rely on your submission, pursue the press. Get the support of your local community board, local advocacy groups, elected officials. Also pursue present day organizations which may have history associated with your case for significance, or a direct link. We've been doing that with organizations that have labor history. If we're pursuing a building that has significant labor history, we go to present day labor organizations in the hopes of getting fees. So the reach out is I think as important as the writing the RFE itself. So the last example I'm going to show you is a building. Actually, it's the center building, which is 88 East 10th Street. Over here, this is 827, 831 Broadway. It was built in 1866, designed by Griffith Thomas, and it was home to Willem de Kooning between 1958 and 1963, among other mid-century artists, including Elaine de Kooning. It was designated a New York City individual landmark in 2017 on this basis. And following this approval, an RFE was also submitted, shown here, which was Willem de Kooning's studio and home prior to 831 Broadway. De Kooning completed Woman 1 upon his move to this studio, and the highway paintings were his final works completed here. He also lived and worked here when he began to exhibit with Sidney Janis. During the fall of 1954 through the next year and a half, the theme of de Kooning's work centered on what Thomas Hess, editor and art critic from the time for Art News, referred to as the abstract urban landscapes. Here, the subject was often New York City, in particular downtown New York, including his surroundings at East 10th Street. One of his urban abstracts was Backyard on 10th Street, seen here from 1956. It depicted the backyard between de Kooning's studio and his. The painting showcased what the art critic Harold Rosenberg called the no environment of East 10th Street, of the East 10th Street art enclave. However, the LPC denied the designation of 88 East 10th Street with the explanation that they had surveyed all the properties associated with de Kooning and felt that 827, 831 Broadway was the most significant. However, a colleague of mine, while researching another topic, found that another significant artist lived and worked here. Quote, one of the most notable sculptors of the 20th century, according to the National Women's History Museum, the Harlem Renaissance artist, educator, and self-described people sculptor, Selma Hortense Burke, lived and worked at 88 East 10th Street from 1949, according to New York City directories. And while here, Burke completed her most renowned work, a 2.5 by 3.5 foot relief plaque commemorating Franklin D. Roosevelt, which was used as a model for his image on the US dime coin. Burke is celebrated for her lifelong commitment to the art of sculpture and to art education, for her highly regarded portrayals of towering African-American figures, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Booker T. Washington, and Mary McLeod Bethune, for her significance in the Harlem Renaissance, for her unabashed drawing upon African models for her art, and for achieving success as a Black woman sculptor at a time when few female or Black artists, or even fewer Black female artists, were able to achieve in the United States. And this additional information has been submitted to LPC recently, so we shall see what happens there. And that finishes my presentation. Oh, it wasn't as short as I thought. Good. And so now I wonder if anybody has any questions. Is Michelle there? Oh, I see chat. Hold on.
Yep. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can put it in the chat.
Oh, request for evaluation. All right, Sean already made fun of me. What else do we have?
George asked, how easy or useful is it to get past RFEs from the LPC for a building you're interested in?
I beg your pardon? Past what?
I think he's asking, can you ask the LPC if RFEs have already been submitted for a building?
That's a good question. I don't see why not. I don't see why it wouldn't be. I don't know when they'd get back to you, but I don't see why you couldn't ask that. It would seem to me that'd be public information. That's a good question, though. I'm going to ask.
Let me know what they say.
I will. See and ask. Are there any other questions?
I've got one. I type slower than I need to. I'm working on an RFP for 2 buildings on the Bowery
Mhm.
that were previously rejected. We now have a lot more information, especially regarding its status as being very, very, very important in that area's abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. Do you feel that emphasizing that is the main thrust that we should go for, especially given their new interest in African American history?
Yeah, well, they say it's not new, but it's they're definitely pushing it, and also they actually cite later on in the press release Underground Railroad sites. I think the biggest problem is actually with 50 West 13th Street. People have been pushing this, but you know, the whole idea of it was secretive, so it's really hard to prove.
Right.
So, you know, that anything you can do in that regard, that's definitely what I would push. But I would do it as a sort of additional information that we have uncovered regarding these buildings.
Okay. Their main push actually isn't the Underground Railroad part. It's the importance of the homeowners as movers and shakers within the movement.
Right.
So we were really wanted to emphasize that. And I got the job after the Duffield site was finally landmarked, and they said, now we can do it. You know, they like Black people now. So, so we're gonna go for it.
I think you should. And I again would say, you know, in addition to the information that we've already submitted, so they're reminded that they've already received information, and maybe you want to link to that or submit that as well, and say this is more information that we've uncovered that which we think you should consider.
Great, thank you.
Dave, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I have a few questions. Why would owner buy-in make a difference?
No, it's not. At the end of the day, for New York City designation, you don't need to have it. But anything that, you know, okay, so when you look at designation reports, they call out at the hearing in the designation report how many people were for it, who spoke against it. My feeling is all positivity, all you know, people being forward, especially the owner, definitely helps in terms of PR and stuff like that, but it's not necessary. For state and national register, for individual listings, you need to have owner buy-in. And for districts, it needs to be the majority. So I wasn't saying that, you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't affect it at all. Believe me, 827, 831 Broadway were not thrilled about getting their buildings designated at all, because it thwarted demolition permits that they had filed for that site. But it definitely can't hurt, especially if you start to get into some sort of PR war over it.
Is it possible to do all the research completely online without going to Hall of Records these days?
It depends on when it was built. The Office of Metropolitan History is a resource traditionally for new building permits between 1900 and it's the 1980s. Right now, you can't access that. They're temporarily down. So like when that's down, then you know there's other sources that you need. It just depends on when it was built. If it's an early 19th century building, I think that's going to be difficult.
Can you explain why the Landmarks Commission seems so reluctant to designate buildings. So like the White Horse Tavern interior seems like a slam dunk to me. I mean, aren't they supposed to be about preserving landmarks? And I mean, it's in our minds, it's already a landmark de
Yeah,
facto.
yeah. Interiors are always difficult. Religious structures are always difficult. Especially with an interior, if it's a museum, well, that's open to the public anyway. So, they're probably not going to get upset about that. They're not going to worry about how that's going to affect people who own it. Something like the White Horse Tavern, they're very, very, very careful about when they designate interiors because it affects how sales later on.
And
I agree. And there's things where they don't designate stuff and it's probably political. And going back to the when we were looking at the church, that calling out the fact that the paint was changed was silly.
right, is there anything that you could point to that can make the difference with landmarks that lately seems to tip them one way or the other? And I've heard a lot of emphasis on narrative versus like facts and deeds and all of that kind of dry stuff.
I think anything that aligns with their, if you're calling out what they are saying that they're pushing, that's definitely going to work in your favor. And one of them is geographic diversity. I called out, in terms of, because there's, people feel that there's certain areas that are more landmarked than others, and that's absolutely true. And so looking at areas that are underrepresented in terms of landmarking is definitely going to work towards you. And LPC said that this is one of our priorities. And also identifying these histories and, significant places associated with these histories, which have been traditionally underrepresented. Those, again, you're aligning with what they've advertised as their priorities. So to me, that's the best thing you can do in terms of going for designation.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Suzanne has.
Yeah, I got another question for you. Were built in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And of course, they've been greatly changed on the first two floors with, 100 years of different kinds of storefronts. And the first time that they were rejected, it was because of that. Any tips on how we can phrase this, because it's not the upper stories and the roof line, it still has the dormers, those are intact, but the ground floor obviously is way out of historic.
But I would call that as part of the transformation of the area and therefore the story of the area. To try and freeze it in time as saying that these, early 19th century buildings just stayed intact is ridiculous, especially on the Bowery, especially over the last 200 years. So to make the case that this speaks to the story of the Bowery and its changes over time, I think is what would be the case I would make. And I mean, when you look at like Sullivan-Thompson district, when they designated that, they called out the storefronts as part of the significance, speaking to the evolution of the area. And so consequently, there was a row house, maybe it was a tenement. No, it was a row house. It was a row house that has had a storefront in its first floor for, since the turn of the 20th century. And because that was called out as part of the significance that the storefronts are part of the Sullivan-Thompson story, when a person was trying to make this house back into a single family house, they left, they were very smart. They did the design so that the first floor recalled that storefront without it being completely glazed. You know what I mean? They did it so it still was able to become back to a single family residence, but they were able to reference that storefront, which again was called out as part of the significance in the designation report. And so, if that's identified as part of the history, then that's the case for significance, and it can also affect regulation later on.
Great, thank you.
Not to interrupt, but we have a Columbus Avenue on the Upper West Side, where lots of retail has changed and the LPC is very comfortable with a lot of changes. And partly the lower floors were always so itinerant because of the 9th Avenue L. And on the Bowery, there was the 3rd Avenue L. So you could make the argument that the elevation maybe really started at the 2nd floor, perhaps, or higher up because the view from the train. You could stretch.
Anything else, Michelle?
I'm not seeing anything else.
All righty.
No? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. This was great. Once again, we have recorded this, so it will be on our YouTube channel where, again, you can watch all of our past preservation schools. And hopefully you join tomorrow and next week as well. And we will see everyone virtually soon. Have a good night.
You too.